started your course because it seemed to just simplify everything. So I actually started studying for the LSAT on and off a few months ago, I think, but I've just kind of been going from one course to another. So I started with the Power Score Bibles, um, but that's a lot of reading and in, several different books, and I just felt like that's a lot of time. I also work a full-time job. So then I transitioned into the LSAT trainer, which was more compact, and it was easier to go through everything, all three components of the LSAT. But then I just wanted some kind of guide, some kind of direction to answer questions like during live sessions, but also kind of point me to the direction of where I might be missing on some of the components. So I've kind of been starting again and again. So I feel like I've got like a foundation. I know what the three components are. I know the basics of all three sections of the LSAT, but I think now I'm finally starting to go deeper into the exam. So that's really why I joined the course.
Well, I'm glad to have you on board and help you reach that next level. Sure. So what would you say is missing for you right now, more specifically in a certain section, a certain question type, or a certain element of just taking this thing?
Well, I think, the one thing I have to say is that I really like that you say you shouldn't really take a diagnostic test or an exam, because I think an analogy that you shared was basically like if you don't speak Mandarin and all of a sudden you're presented with a test in Mandarin, you won't really do well because you don't know the language. So I think that was really nice because that's how I felt when I took a diagnostic. Obviously, I think the test is learnable. It's not like rocket science, but at the same time, it does require that one learn what the techniques are, what the test actually is trying to say, and what the writers have prepared and why, and just practice it. Because, like, I do understand why they've made this test. I don't think it's just some random test that they've created to kind of create like an obstacle for people. I think the things that it does test would probably be very helpful in law school as well, because I'm sure this is how lawyers also think about their cases, or about the little details that go into, I guess, cases. So it makes sense to me. Right now, where I'm at is just figuring out how to approach the questions. So I think the necessary and sufficient assumptions are kind of the confusing ones, because when I was learning before I took the course, when I was learning from the LSAT trainer, it made sense. The sufficient assumptions made sense. So the answers would have to fill a gap that's in the argument, or it's kind of like a flaw question. But the necessary assumptions, I was really having a hard time approaching those questions, because I just couldn't figure out what the answers would be before I even read the answer choices, if that makes sense. So I think just getting some ground on those two questions. Another thing I think for logic games would be the rule substitution element. I think I even mentioned it to you a few days ago. Just figuring out what the rules, or like what rules would not be more limiting, but also not less limiting. So the exact same effect. I think that's something that I need to practice more on and just learn a few more techniques about.
Let's leave it there. We've already got a little bit to work on just with those. We'll get to reading comp in a moment, but I want to make sure we don't lose the thread, because you've already mentioned a couple of big things.
Yeah.
So for logical reasoning, you mentioned the gap in the argument, flaw questions, and necessary assumption questions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Those are two areas you have trouble with both, you would say?
I wouldn't say both of them equally. I would say I have more trouble with necessary assumption questions than sufficient. But I think just making the distinction between the two is the difficult part. Like, this is sufficient and this is necessary. Yeah,
of course. I mean, there are a lot of prep systems out there that lump the two together, which is incredibly problematic. They'll just say assumption. Right. And the thing is that they're asking for very different things, even though any argument containing a gap between evidence and conclusion is not airtight. It has some underlying assumptions. It has some underlying unstated principles or unstated pieces of evidence that may or may not be true, but we're not given those as given. So it's open to question, open to interpretation. Every argument on the LSAT contains some kind of gap. They're not giving us airtight arguments because then there's not really a whole lot to do with them.
Right. I think regarding necessary assumption questions, some of the questions that I was missing when I was practicing were questions that the choice that I picked was one that kind of filled the gap completely. But then necessary assumption questions don't really have to fill the gap, right? They just have to be true. So I think I was going for answer choices that fix the argument completely, but maybe doesn't need any fixing, just has to be true at all times. Would you say that that's a correct way to think about that?
That's correct, yes. So sufficient assumption, on the other hand, is new information that, if true, closes the gap 100%. And maybe even goes beyond that. Maybe it's even stronger than it needs to be, but that's fine. The thing is that it's sufficient. Necessary, as you said, simply needs to be the case. And if it weren't true, the argument would fall apart. Now, you asked about telling the difference. And so I've got plenty of material on this in the course. I have a number of different workshops just on necessary assumption and just on sufficient assumption. And in both of those types of workshops, I touch on the differences because it is it's a common problem area for many students. The short answer is that there's a key word or phrase in the question stem that helps you distinguish between them. So necessary assumption questions will have a question stem with a word or phrase synonymous with necessity. And sufficient assumption questions will have a word or phrase in the question stem synonymous with sufficiency. So I've got lists of them in the course and lists of them in those related workshops, but necessary assumption indicator words could be things like depends upon, requires, or assumes. So words and phrases synonymous with necessity. So that's an easy way to tell. If you see any of those, it's necessary assumption. Sufficient assumption will have words or phrases synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, properly inferred if assumed. So just keep an eye out for those keywords and you'll be good.
Yeah. I think also another thing with necessary assumption questions, I think I recognized that they were necessary assumption questions. I knew that that was what I was looking at here. But I think that, or at least from the practice that I've done, what I found is that necessary assumption questions will also present, the correct answer will present information that I probably didn't see coming or I didn't see. But sufficient assumption questions, I mean, I can see the gap in the reasoning. I knew what the flaw was. So I know what I'm looking for, so it's easier to find the right answer. But I think the difficulty with necessary assumption questions is that they might present some extra information that may not seem important to me, but they have to be true for the argument to work, or not even work, but just for the conclusion to be true. So I guess finding the answer choice and not being so fixed on finding a certain element of the argument and being ready to see all different possibilities, I think maybe that's more accurate to say that that's the difficulty.
Okay, fantastic. So we're drilling deeper now, and that's really a more interesting discussion we can have then, because you can already get the keywords from the workshops. So, and you can get this. What I'm about to say is also covered in the workshops as well, but I'll touch on it here since you brought it up. So, necessary assumption questions. One thing that can make them difficult is that there is often information required by the argument that may not immediately come to mind simply based on what they're talking about in the stimulus, because tougher necessary assumption questions will ask you about things that are required for the argument to be true, but may not have come to mind. So the argument must be defended against alternative possibilities that could problematize the claim in the argument.
Right.
So an example of this would be, there's this famous LSAT question I love to use as examples. It's covered in the course, the rattlesnake folktale question from Prep Test 30. So this question in particular is tough because I don't want to give it away, but what I will say is that the argument assumes that if you were to remove one particular thing, this rattlesnake age test works perfectly. So they're saying then that there are no other potential problems with the rattlesnake age test other than that one element. So X cannot problematize the test. Y cannot problematize that test. And X and Y were not mentioned explicitly in the stimulus, but they cannot be permitted to impact how well that age test works. So it's like when you see X in a choice and you're like, well, they never talked about X. They didn't need to talk about X because X is within a larger category.
Okay.
I know this is abstract. I don't want to spell out all the details, but look up that question in Prep Test 30 and give it a shot after we get off this call. It's one of the hardest questions of all time, but by reviewing this, if you can get that, then you can get any question of this type.
Okay. I'll try that one after we're done here.
Cool. Now, you also mentioned rule substitution questions in logic games. I have this workshop specifically on those as well. I know we've talked about that before because it's something that people ask about a lot. And as you said, no more limiting or no less limiting. You want a new proposed rule that, if valid or if true, is as a replacement for the original rule, would have the exact same consequence. So if it's no more limiting, that means that it would not render any previously valid scenario invalid. So you just check all your previous hypotheticals you've drawn over the course of the game. If it would make any of those not work, it's too strong.
Okay.
And then less limiting, try to make a new scenario and see if it would allow things that previously were not possible under the original constraints. Also look at, in general, what inferences can you derive based on the new proposed rule? Does it match up with the inferences you got initially?
Okay.
So those are all things to look for.
Sure.
Tell me how that sits with you. Does that clarify anything?
Yeah, I think the thing is, like, a lot of it makes sense when I'm learning the strategies. I think it just all comes down to practicing after that. So I think that I still need to do a lot of practice.
Yeah.
Work with
Well,
yeah.
Drills. Yeah. I mean, you can use drills. I mean, there's also, I have a whole list of every rule substitution question that ever appeared, starting with exam 57. Nearly every exam's contained one of them.
Okay.
So start with 57 and just work your way up.
Right. I think another question I had for you was, so I have a test in April that I'm going to take. And this was, so I had planned to take the test in August of last year in person, but then that got canceled. And so they offered, take the flex in August, or you can take it before April or until April. And so at that time I decided to take it in April. I won't go into the details, but I haven't had a lot of time since then to study completely focused on the LSAT because of other things, the pandemic as well. But so I think, but I'm still planning on taking the test because I realized that for the first time test takers, they allow you to remove the score if you're not happy with it, right? So I was kind of thinking I'll take it so I get the real sense of what it feels like to take the exam. Because I'm planning to take it again in August. So for that, I'm following your 6-month plan for August. But since I'm also taking in April, do you think I should kind of tweak the schedule a bit to take a few or take a few time tests before April? Or should I hold off on that and just focus on the August?
Well, my question for you is still why you're taking April, though, other than the fact that LSAC let you reschedule it through April, I assume at no additional charge. So are you taking April simply because that's the end point for getting that free LSAT administration? Or is there another reason you want to take it in April?
Just that. I mean, it's already set up. I already paid for the one in August, so I feel like it'll just go to waste if I don't take it. But at the same time, I see what you're saying. Like, if I'm already planning to take it in August, why take it in April? Yeah, I was thinking about that. I'm not entirely sure what I should do, whether I should take both or I should just skip the one in April and then take it in August. I don't know.
I hear what you're saying. Yeah. So it sounds to me like the only reason you're taking it in April up to this point is just the inertia of having it already scheduled.
Right.
So
just getting a real timed experience, I guess.
So what are the downsides of taking it in April when you're not ready?
I guess a bad score, potentially. And I guess it would have already been my first time taking it. So if in August it's not a score that I like, then I wouldn't be able to clean the slate, and it would exist on record. That for me would be the downside.
Well, you can still cancel August too. I mean, score preview is a nice thing. It kind of mitigates some stress. But if you already know you're not going to reach your fullest potential in April, and you know that you haven't had enough time, and you're going to have an additional 4 months or so between April and August during which you could improve significantly, then what that means is that April is simply nothing more than a dry run. And that's your score preview option, not August. Now, taking it twice, taking it 3 times, no big deal at all. It's normal to take it 2 or 3 times, and law schools don't average multiple scores even if you kept it. But my thought is, why have a score on record? Why have a take on record if you can avoid it, if you don't need it? Because then let's say you take April, you know that's not going to be the one for you. You'll probably cancel the score.
Yeah.
Or you'll probably just cancel it because you won't want to have a relatively lower score on record.
Yeah.
So August is like the real thing. Now, August, of course, we hope it'll go well. You've got plenty of time to make that happen. I'm sure it'll be fine. But things can happen. There can be tech issues, internet connection issues, ProctorU issues, test day stress issues. Then your next take would then be October. So then you'll have 3 takes on record versus October being your second take.
Right.
And you may feel differently about October, knowing this is already the 3rd one. You might place more importance on it because you feel that there's more significance on that versus it being the 2nd one. Like you could do April, August, October, or you could do August, October, November. Neither of those are desirable, of course. Most people just want to do it once and be done.
Yeah, exactly.
But I wonder how you might feel if you were to take October, knowing that that was already the 3rd time.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think another downside taking in April might also be that I will have to tweak the schedule at all. I mean, if I just follow the schedule as is, then it makes more sense to go up to that August point and make sure that I've prepped myself enough in the right way to take that August test and be done. Because I think 5 months is, especially because I'm really dedicated to this exam. I mean, even though I am working a full-time job, I am dedicating several hours a day to studying it and many more hours over the weekend. So I definitely think that I can reach that goal by August. But yeah, you're right. If I do take it in April, it might be a distraction to just take it for the heck of it, and have to kind of go away from that schedule. Yeah, you're right. I might not take it then. I guess we'll see. But I do see what you're saying about that.
Yeah, sure.
I just take it in August and just follow through with that plan, because I do think that I have confidence that, I think it will be fine. I think I can reach the goal by August, because I don't really want to take it in October.
Sure. The other thing is that, I mean, we can tweak the schedule for you if you really needed to for April. My concern more is you would be using potentially recent practice test material.
Yeah.
And you might want to save that for the August take since that's the focus.
Right. And I understand what you're saying about that as well, because if I take in April, which is only a month from now, it's absolutely true that I will not be as prepared in April as I probably will be in August. And like you said, the recent exams I should probably save for that August test. So yeah, that makes sense. Definitely.
Fantastic. Great. Now, what are some other ways you could get a timed experience? Because you mentioned that was one reason you might want to go for April.
Right. Well, I learned about the LSAT Flex, and basically there's a proctor who's kind of watching you take the exam. So I guess I could, I don't know, ask one of my friends or family members to volunteer and keep me on FaceTime and on mute, and they can watch me take a timed exam. Maybe that's kind of creating a timed experience for myself, but it's not the actual thing. It's not going on record. It's just the comfort of my own home, and LSAT Flexes anyway, but just not on record. So maybe that's something I could try.
Sure. You can do FaceTime with friends or family. We've got study groups in the course where students do this together, and you can do it over Zoom if you like as well. And you can just do it on Law Hub too. I mean, you can have Law Hub open regardless. I mean, it's timed in there, and you're talking about Flex for April, but August is going to be, they're not calling it the Flex starting in August. They're going to have that 4th experimental section as well. Have you heard about that?
Yep, I've heard about that.
Yeah, so that'll be something to practice too.
Right. And that was also even before I talked to you, I was thinking, should I take it in April? I mean, I was planning on it because it's already there, but should I take it? Because I heard about this August component that they're adding the fourth element. And then it would be it'd be two kinds of practices, right? Because if I took the test in April, that's just three tests, and maybe there would be a difference in prepping for that, but then also prepping for the August where there might be that experimental section, it would require a different kind of momentum or a different kind of discipline to do all four tests at once. Yeah, talking to you today, now I'm leaning towards not taking the test in April. So
I hear that. Yeah, I mean, it's slightly different. You're right. It's a slightly different way to prep because the August exam will have that fourth unscored, unknown experimental section placed anywhere within the exam. And so there's a slight difference in how you'd prep for a test day experience because there's the endurance factor of doing 4 sections rather than 3. You also have a break in the middle between sections 2 and 3. So your flex practice for April, and then for anyone going for June as well, they'd also be dealing with that 3 sections only back to back. But August and beyond, 4 sections with the break, a little bit different in terms of testing. And you have plenty of time to prep for that format regardless, but you want to take it when you're ready, typically. It's the goal. Now, you also mentioned reading comp earlier, and we didn't touch on that. So I want to make sure we address any reading comp questions you might have.
To be honest with you, I haven't really had much experience with reading comp as I have with the other two. So I'm not sure exactly. I think reading comp, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's just logical reasoning, but in a longer passage, right? Would that be fair to say, or would it be more aligned with other standardized tests, like the GRE, for example?
Between those two options you laid out, it's closer to LSAT logical reasoning. It's more argument-based, right, and it is longer, as you said. You could think about it as a much longer logical reasoning stimulus, where there might be more filler in there. There's some questions that relate to logical reasoning style within reading comp. Some of the harder questions in a set will be like strengthen, weaken, parallel. They also have questions relating to main point, tone, title, which might be more similar to what you see on the GRE, but it's definitely harder than what they have on other standardized tests. So it requires its own type of prep and its own focus. So I'd say start with logical reasoning so that you get the taste of it as you have been. And then I have plenty of deep dive sessions in the course going through how to interpret and analyze those passages, because there is a lot of substance in there.
Okay. Well, based on the experience that I've had on logical reasoning, the limited experience I've had, it seems like the questions on the reading comprehension section, it's more like the objective questions from logical reasoning than the questions that kind of ask you to pick the argument apart, if I'm catching that correctly, because a lot of the questions are, so what's the author's main point, or what is the author trying to say in this or that? But it's not really asking you, well, what does the author get wrong in this argument? Or, so is that correct in saying that that's kind of what the reading comp section is primarily like?
Yes and no. I mean, you're right that they're not really looking, the reading comp passages, there's not really flaws in them per se. There's not flaws. They're not looking for you to pick apart their arguments in that sense. But there are structure related questions in terms of, similar to LSAT logical reasoning, role of statement. So what role does the second sentence of the 4th paragraph play? Or what is the role, what is the purpose of the author's reference to this particular fact in the 3rd paragraph? Right. So they're looking for you to dissect, but they're not looking for you to criticize. They're looking for you to more identify, I would say. But then they will ask you things like strengthen and weaken, which could relate to potential gaps.
Okay. So I guess for the reading comprehension, for me, it would just be about endurance, because it would be longer passages, and just keeping in mind that I have to have the main argument, or just the main gist of the passage, and not be too concerned with knowing every single word on every single sentence, just the main points, to make sure that I understand what the passage is about. But I think that just takes practice. So I think it's more about practice on that section for me.
Yeah, that's a great starting point too. I mean, if nothing else, you want to make sure you're able to walk away from having read that passage with the main idea, the primary purpose, the author's opinion, which all overlap quite a bit, but that's the biggest thing you want to walk away with. And then also noting where the details are so you can go back and find them when you need to, but also make sure you're not getting bogged down by the nitty-gritty of those details in the moment during your initial read.
Right. I actually just thought of something that I just thought of something. This is like important for both logical reasoning and reading comprehension. So I don't come from a natural science or the hard science background. I studied social science. I studied international relations in college. So I'm more towards that area. So I think whenever I'm reading passages or logical reasoning stimuli that is about natural science or about, you know, chemistry or whatever you, what have you, I think that's when I get kind of nervous, like reading the passages. So what would be your suggestion in just thinking about it as just a logical reasoning stimuli or just a passage that I have to read and deconstruct than it being a scientific passage?
Sure. Well, first off, know that you're not alone in that. Definitely most pre-laws, I think, tend towards your end of things. And I do personally as well. I was a political science major. Hard science and natural science is not my thing. I would say you recognize that it's about arguments. It's about structure. It's not about details. You don't need to be an expert in anything natural science. And the varied scientific topics mean that it's not about having the knowledge in any particular domain of biology, chemistry, physics, or anything like that. It's about much more simply what are the claims the author is making, or what claims is the author describing, and then how does the author go about describing those arguments or laying out those arguments. So role of statement type things, method of reasoning type things. That's the layer at which you want to interpret these passages. The details of what the actual science is, you can always go back and find them when you need to. And you can also work to dumb it down for yourself. Use simpler language than what they're using for yourself when you can. And my deep dive sessions are all about that.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now. And I'm just following the schedule and following all the videos. And I'm really happy to have like the live course. I'm actually really enjoying your course, I just have to say, because even just the study guides that you've kind of laid out in the schedule, it's almost like a game. It's almost, and this is, I never thought I'd say this, but it's almost fun when I'm studying. And maybe that's the best way to be, because then I actually want to do better at it, just figure out a game. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. It's just figuring out, especially the logic games. It's like fun to play around with it. So hopefully by August, I'll reach that.
I certainly hope you do too. And I have no doubt that you will. I'm really glad this schedule and the course are helping so much. So
yeah,
just keep at it, keep doing what you're doing, keep showing up, and I'll see you in class soon. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.